the reality is, there was an aspect of, if something seems too good to be true, you probably need to sort of re-examine your priors in a certain extent. And I think that's the story of China over 20 years, or the last 20, 25, 30 years, where we've not just sort of excused the outsourcing of so much of our capabilities to China and sort of hollowed out so many of our own sort of capabilities, but the fact we've done it while patting ourselves on the back that actually this is for the sake of freedom has that should have raised a few more questions sort of along the way. And all this is in conjunction with China. You would see China liberating, and certainly from an economic perspective, the changes that happened from 1990 to 2005 were pretty spectacular. And there was a certain aspect where China was almost more capitalistic than the U.S., particularly when you with the removal of a lot of red tape and the sheer sort of cutthroat competition that developed in the private sector, like a level of competition that would be absolutely shocking to a lot of people in the West that think that there's a lot of competition in the U.S., sort of, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, number one, there were a few crown jewels that were always sort of kept under sort of the party's auspices. But then Xi Jinping changed the equation in that Xi Jinping's a true believer. He has been talking about sort of Marxist sort of values and approaches from the moment he has appeared on the scene. And I think there's a bit where the U.S. broadly and this sort of postmodern mindset generally just sort of didn't take it seriously, because we don't believe in anything and it assumes that no one else believes in anything either. But what if they do? What if they're actually what if actually all these speeches he's given and all these things that you can access, what if we actually took them seriously? If we did, and if we do, none of this is a surprise. And not just that, but the idea that you would allow not just a channel that could be used in theory, but a channel that aligns with a declaration that we are going to export our point of view. It is important that we fight ideological battles, not just in China, but abroad. All these views of even Xi Jinping have been assumed, he's just consolidating power in China. Like, that's the goal. And certainly that is the primary motivation. But Xi Jinping has said in speech after speech after speech, this aspect of exporting this point of view, because we need to fight these ideological battles abroad so that Western liberalism doesn't encroach upon China. So even if it's motivated by self-preservation, the intended battlefield, according to Xi Jinping's own words, has long been sort of abroad. And in that context, it's, to your point, insane that we would allow direct Chinese control of this channel that reaches hearts and minds and over which we have zero visibility and control. Again, I don't like this aspect of taking private property away from a company.
Right.
To the extent that company is an independent company. I don't like the idea of leveraging app stores and ISPs and infrastructure generally in this sort of way. But everything is a trade-off, and this idea that you're going to allow an ideologically motivated, who has said on the record on multiple occasions that we need to export our point of view, to have control of this channel is nuts. And there's an aspect of this should be a wake-up call to the U.S., not just about TikTok, but about, if we don't believe what we're fighting for, that's sort of an even greater challenge.
Right. No, you described it. I think the word you used in the TikTok piece was solipsistic, and it captures it well in terms of the way many Americans approach this problem. And I think it's key to understanding why TikTok is potentially an urgent issue. You have to understand the CCP and what some of the CCP's objectives have been under
Xi Jinping in particular. Yeah. I mean, I like, and I think that's probably another piece. Like, if Mao Zedong was still in charge, very pragmatic, like, certainly, still a Maoist or communist or whatever you want to call it in certain regards. But, I think there was a bit where this point of view was understandable because China was becoming very pragmatic about these things. And so you could look at things like the incentive structure and what sort of makes sense. And you could probably feel like, maybe in a crisis, you could see China leaning on this. Are they going to have some sort of systematic approach to take a particular point of view? Probably not. Doesn't seem worth the trouble. And frankly, that still might be the case with TikTok. I mean, one of the other things to note is TikTok is like by far the most censorious of the US social networks. And like they're sort of, you know, eagerness to adopt sort of the current prevailing political points of view and then sort of limit or promote videos in that regard is way stronger than even Google or YouTube or whatever it might be, in part because I think they perceive that was like the route to make sure they don't get in trouble. I think that they were worried about showing stuff that the US media would object to, and so they've been super extreme in that regard. But even to the extent that you think this might not come up, your calculations should have changed when Xi Jinping took over. Like, look at China. China's economy is less free. They have cracked down on all their tech companies at like the killer moment when like AI is sort of coming along, and it was a horrible miscalculation. You could argue that there's been a lot of horrible miscalculations about what Xi Jinping has done in China, but that's the fact that he seems to be doing a lot of things that don't seem optimal, that don't seem to line up with economic incentives, should actually make you more concerned in this place, because it suggests we're dealing with someone who actually believes what he says, who actually is implementing the stuff that he says he's going to implement. So when he says we are ideological, we do believe in this particular point of view, we are going to push back against Western liberalism, not just at home, but abroad. Like, he's been consistent about everything else to China's detriment. Why wouldn't he be consistent about this?
Yeah, no, 100%. And so in terms of the next steps here, one question that will be raised frequently over the next several weeks, if this proceeds in the House and then onto the Senate, and then I'm sure there would be a legal challenge if there's actually legislation passed. But what do you think about the First Amendment argument in this context, and how any of this implicates the First Amendment?
I don't see how it implicates the First Amendment at all. I think this is a ridiculous argument.
Neither do I. And it makes me wonder whether I didn't spend enough time in constitutional law or something, because it keeps being raised. It was cited by a Montana judge who slapped down a proposed TikTok ban in Montana. Granted, that was a preliminary injunction, but I just don't see how this is really a First Amendment issue. And this is another case where the broader context isn't as well known to some of the people who are arguing about this, but like, we've had laws in this country for a long time. Like, there was a law passed before World War II, the Communications Act. A section of that law restricted foreign ownership of radio stations for all the same concerns that people today have about TikTok. And so I just don't know that this really does infringe on the right to free speech in any way, really.
Well, first off, a China corporation does not have the right to free speech in the United States, nor does the Chinese government. It's not a U.S. citizen, for one.
No standing for Xi Jinping to sue on First Amendment grounds.
Number two, I mean, like, anyone expressing speech on TikTok can express that speech sort of somewhere else. This is about the medium at play, not the sort of speech at hand. I mean, just from the Montana thing's ridiculous. I mean, just from any sort of, anyone with any sort of basic understanding of constitutional law, of course, there's no sort of free speech sort of issue here. Now, if you want to make a sort of philosophical point, which I think would be fair for people who disagree with me to come back on, in that I'm the one that's made the argument frequently about sort of the culture of free speech and that sort of aspect, I would say, number one, again, the law does not ban TikTok. It bans ByteDance's ownership of TikTok. So if they want to divest it and maintain that channel because they believe so deeply in free speech, number one, I don't see them lobbying in favor of Facebook to have access to China. But number two, easily solved. If that's what matters to you, spin it off, sell it to another entity, and there's no problem here. This is like the most I'm irritated talking about it because it's the most transparent sort of cynical leveraging of something they don't believe in that we're supposed to waste time responding to. But number three, everything's a trade-off, right? Like, I am, to the free speech point, I am actually very uncomfortable with this process for the reasons I articulated. We are sort of leveraging for the first time tools that could be used to limit free speech, where it comes to making Apple take an app down or telling ISPs they can't allow certain content. from the perspective of someone that cares about the philosophy and the culture of free speech, it's by far the biggest concern I have about this entire thing.
Yep.
Everything's a trade-off. Like that's just sort of the reality, and that's the challenge of these sorts of things. I think when I think through what matters, the idea of a ideologically motivated, spoken willingness to leverage this ability and the capability to leverage for an adversary having access to this channel is, in my mind, in the sort of balance, a larger concern than breaking the seal on these other things, even though it worries me tremendously, given the last few years, that we are breaking the seal on these capabilities or potentially doing so.